Hi, this is Ed Partyka, and joining me is Kasperi Sarikoski, the lead trombone player of the UMO Helsinki Jazz Orchestra. And we would just like to summarize a little bit of what we talked about in our educational and instructional videos. We recorded them all today, and at the beginning, when we started, we weren't quite exactly sure which direction some of the conversations would take, and I think there were some very interesting things that came up. If you'd like to summarize, from your opinion, what are maybe the most important points that that younger players or less experienced players should think about when they're trying to become better section players? What are some of the important topics or the most important things from your opinion or your perspective?
Right. Well, I think first and foremost, listening to the recordings, knowing the style of the music that you're playing is paramount, and also listening to your colleagues. I noticed that with younger musicians, they just have not developed that sense of awareness of what's going on around them. And with younger musicians, you need to be pointing out things more, or more experienced musicians, you need to point things out much more than you would to experienced players who hear things. And it's also a case of knowing what to listen for, and that's something that you develop over time. So typical things that we listen for and know what to what to look out for are the lengths of notes, balance, of course intonation. That's important, but it's there are certain reoccurring themes that happen all throughout big band music that we talk about a lot, and it's more about listening to those key elements of section playing, breathing, and those are the sort of very, very typical and important things about playing in a section. So listening to everybody, but also knowing which things to listen for.
Yeah, and another important point, this was also mentioned by your colleagues in the trumpet section yesterday, and is to listen to the original recordings of these historically important pieces of music. And as I mentioned before, one of the problems that we have these days, in my opinion, is this flood of information that we have. In the old days, it was pretty clear. You would go to a record store. If you wanted to listen to a recording of Mote and Swing by Count Basie, you'd look in the record bin, and there'd be a record, Count Basie's Orchestra, Mote and Swing. And now, if you look online, YouTube, you type in Mote and Swing, there are 4,738 recordings of Mote and Swing, and most of them are not of the same quality of the Count Basie Orchestra, because a lot of amateur musicians, a lot of not so experienced people are posting things, and sometimes it's difficult to find these original recordings or the correct recordings. So I would like to ask you, for our listeners and our viewers, if you would be so kind with your colleagues and maybe to put together a listening list for us and for them. This is something the trumpet section is going to be doing, and I would like to ask you if that would be possible for you guys to do too, because you guys have years of listening experience. And I think that would really be a help and a guide to help filter out the nuggets of really great information. The golden recordings, the original recordings that sometimes are in this day and age, even though information is so accessible, sometimes they are hard to find. Would that be something that you guys can do?
Of course, yes. We can go through the sort of the history of big band music and pick out. It doesn't need to necessarily be the most famous tunes, because that's something that we have a lot of sort of classics playlists that you can find nowadays and compilations. But maybe from a musician's point of view, what are the tunes? What are the songs that highlight certain important aspects of section playing and big band playing, even though they may not be quite as familiar to the larger jazz public?
Yeah, because that sounds also very, very interesting for people who maybe have some big band experience. Maybe they know some of the classics. They know "In the Mood" from Glenn Miller, but maybe there's some things that address trombone section playing from Glenn Miller's orchestra that might even be more interesting or more valuable for trombone players, and maybe something that the general public is not so interested in. So thank you very much for that sort of guidance. That will really help a lot. And so coming back, listening, incredibly important. One of the things that our colleagues in the trumpet section talked about is finding a good teacher to have individual lessons with. It's something we didn't really talk about today, but what's your feeling on that? Should young or amateur trombone players, should they find a good teacher, a private teacher, or is trombone something you can learn as by yourself as an autodidact through an autodidactic process? I mean, the trumpet players had a very strong opinion. What's your opinion on that?
I think that having a teacher in the early stage is important to sort of lay the foundation. Just from a technical point of view, most of all, talking about embouchure, talking about tongue placement and the maybe breathing a little bit, but I think a lot of the stylistic things can be picked up just by listening, and that's not something that you need or maybe even should have a teacher sort of highlight or sort of underscore everything for you. I think that's we learn by listening. We learn language by listening. So a lot of those things should, I think, be sort of intuitively and naturally picked up from recordings. Otherwise, you're basically becoming just, it's better to listen to recordings than have a Simon Says as a teacher, if you know what I mean, who just says, do this, do this, do this. So I think it will be much, you will have to internalize the information that your teacher provides anyway. So regarding style, yes, I think it's important to listen to recordings, but maybe for a more soloistic and unique approach, if you're talking about me finding my own way of playing the trombone, my own personal voice, that's something that definitely you will have to spend time on your own. But from maybe a more professional sort of bread and butter blue collar musician approach, there are certain industry standards that certainly will help if you have an experienced teacher lay those out for you.
Okay, great. Here's a question. For you personally as a trombone player, who are your biggest role models or your inspirations from the trombone world? Could you maybe give us a few names?
Do you mean specifically regarding section playing or
well,
just generally?
Why don't we start with, let's start general, and then if you had any inspiration or any section players or lead players that you in particularly that you love or that influenced your playing. So let's start with general trombone players or any general musicians, and then maybe moving specifically to big band section or lead players.
Right. Well, when I started playing out the trombone, I listened to a certain amount of J.J. Johnson, of course. Conrad Herwig was a big hero for me in my early years. But I pretty quickly switched to listening to non-trombonists, which I think is very important. In fact, I think for me, it's almost gone the other way around. I spent most of my youth and my basically most of my 20s listening to non-trombone players, which I highly recommend because it teaches you a lot about music from a different perspective. You learn about improvisation from, well, let's face it, we trombone players aren't exactly the apex of improvisers. You have some fantastic improvisers in other instruments, and we're trying our best, but we don't always we don't always match what the others are doing. But so from a sort of harmonic and improvisational and artistic point of view, I think you do, and I strongly recommend you listen to non-trombonists. But in order to maybe have a developed sound for the trombone, especially if you're looking to work as a versatile musician, it's good to listen to a wide plethora of trombone players as well. So who would I name? Well, regarding big band playing, I really like I like listening to Vincent Gardner nowadays, who plays with the Jazz and Lincoln Center Orchestra. I like listening to Nick Marchione, who plays with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra. Ryan Kaiser, again, JLCO. These are sort of lead player heroes of mine. I suppose those would be the newer names. They're not the historic names that people often throw out, but maybe I will get to them later on.
Well, I mean, these are contemporaries and people who are
Right.
live on the scene now.
Yes.
And they're people who you've heard live. And of course, I mean, I have to also say from my experience, the players or the bands that inspired me were the bands and the players I heard live. I mean, listening to recordings, as we've mentioned, it is very, very important. But I really think that this inspiration comes from hearing live music and live bands.
Oh, absolutely.
And I guess let's follow this a little further. Are there any trombone sections or big bands that have influenced or inspired you greatly? Where you, when maybe you were younger and you weren't sure what you were going to do, which direction your career would take, and you heard a band or a big band or something, and you just thought, oh my God, I'd really, that just inspires me. I want to do that. I mean, were there any sort of aha moments like that for you?
Well, there have been plenty of artists and groups that have influenced me and wanted me to become a musician. I don't think they were, at my early stage as a young boy, I don't think they were all big bands. A lot of small groups and other just soloists. But definitely, the UMO big band growing up in Helsinki was really important to me. I remember going to listen to some of the concerts with my dad. We were well underage and illegally participating in jazz events at jazz clubs. But we knew the doorman, so he let us in. But yeah, this band was very important to me, and I thankfully got to work with them, sub with them at a really fairly young age, and I that sort of goes back to the live aspect of hearing music. We definitely were impressed by hearing this music, and maybe orchestral music in general doesn't really fully resound to the listener. The power of a big band doesn't really completely translate through a recording. I think there's a certain power, especially with acoustic orchestral music, that really can blow your hair off. So Vanguard Jazz Orchestra as well. I remember hearing the Mingus big band when I was young, and who else? Yeah, I suppose those have been some of the more important factors. But yes, definitely the several times that I heard the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra in New York, and it's just so more powerful emotionally and in every way to hear an orchestra live. So I do recommend that people go out and listen to concerts if they can.
Exactly, which is something that we are hoping for, as the situation here with the pandemic evolves. And enough people get hopefully immunized and the mutations aren't so crazy and all that sort of stuff. So we hope that we'll be performing for live audiences again soon as a complete orchestra. Any other final comments, Kasperi, about section playing or about life in general?
Well, no, I think we've covered. Of course, there's so much to cover, but we've covered quite a fair amount in these videos. Thank you, Ed. All I would just like to say is just to encourage people to keep learning, keep finding new challenges, keep digging into new material. Don't try and avoid staying on a plateau for too long. There's always so much to learn. I'm right now. I'm sort of been listening to more of the classical orchestral music, and that I find very inspiring at the moment. So, if talking of inspirations, I find listening to and playing some of the classical low brass repertoires is really opening up my ears to things that I can imply into big band music as well. So that's just an encouragement to anybody out there. Keep on studying, keep on listening, keep on practicing.
Thank you very much, Kasperi. And on behalf of the UMO Helsinki Jazz Orchestra, my name's Ed Partyka. Thanks for watching.